Hello everyone, it's 23rd of August 2018, I think, on this wet, cold summer's day. This is a revisit to myself and Trey's podcast on trauma. That'll be just one thing we talk about. We may well cover other things in the future. And we're going to revisit the last one that we did when we talked about Trey's personal trauma. We're going to look a little bit at that, but we're also going to look at trauma itself as it stands alone and what it is, the symptoms of. And recently Trey went to First Steps, who, if you don't know who they are, they're a really good mental health charity who help people with different mental health problems. It's probably the right time for Trey to start this treatment. We don't know how it's going to go. She doesn't know how it's going to go. The first session was pretty okay. There's still work to do. It's going to take a long time, but I think if you follow this, because we will revisit each time when Trey's had her counselling sessions, and maybe this will help yourself to explore yours. So I'm going to go over to Trey. I'm going to ask her a question, and the question is going to be what she thinks trauma is.
Oh, there's a question.
So I'll put you on the spot.
Yeah, I thought you were going to ask me something easy. Not an easy one, right? What is trauma to me? Trauma to me is damage, and it's a damage to your psyche, mental, brain, and it has an overall effect on your body and your emotions, your mind and your brain. Damage caused by something traumatic, or something that's traumatic over a long time, and it doesn't have to be something like a major accident or a major loss. It can be something that's less but over a longer time, like attrition and control and bullying. So there's all kinds of things that can cause trauma.
So then, there's a definition of trauma. You'll probably find it on Wikipedia and things like that, but I think we've got to be careful that we put people in a box, because once you've given a definition to a particular thing, it becomes so.
Yeah.
And I think the word itself, trauma, is something that's sudden and quite catastrophic, and you have to be careful again that you don't look at trauma itself as just one event, because there could be one traumatic event which then other layers of that continue along for the lifetime. It could just be one standalone event that hits you, and then that inhibits your movement through everyday life. So there's two aspects there. One is that you experience it, but then it continues with other layers of trauma. Bullying, you mentioned earlier on there. So if we're going to look at how we work with it, we have to be very careful we don't define it too clearly and just stand that alone on its own, because other people's trauma might be slightly different and they're looking at it in a different way.
Yeah.
So the next question I'm going to ask you is, do you believe that trauma is a mental health problem?
I'm not sure on that one, because to me it feels more organic. Yes, I think there's the mind part of it, but it also feels for me, because of how it's affected me, an organic problem. And I believe that because of how I had tried to cope with it from a young age. Now, if it was just emotional or mental, then some of the things that happened I would cope with that wouldn't have happened. Because from a very young age, how could you make those mental, emotional choices? You're still developing. So a lot of things seem to have happened almost like your body trying to do things, like it would if you broke a limb and then it tries to adapt. And that to me is organic. So I think there's two aspects to that, personally.
So, obviously that makes sense, and I do get that. Physically, your body will do what you want it to do, as in lift things, run, walk, or whatever. But you mentioned about it being more of a physical thing. Now, obviously, trauma is looked at as affecting the brain and the way that you think.
Yeah.
It creates all kinds of different feelings: fear, vulnerability. Yeah. So when you're saying about that, because I need to explore that a little bit more. When you're saying that it's more of an organic kind of physical thing, can you explain that a bit more about how it feels?
Yeah. The only thing how I can try and explain it is something I've worked out. I instinctually put things away, and I see it as a mental thing I did. I didn't think about it, it just happened because I couldn't cope as a child. You don't have the tools to do that kind of stuff. So you can't consciously say you've done that. It's something that instinctively does that to protect you. So I have two parts of me. I'm like, it's like there's two parts of me, two personalities, and that is how the trauma has affected me physically. So I have me, who I think of as me that's the compassion that connects, where my joy comes from, my enjoyment, my laughter, my interest in life. But there's another part of me that is, I call trauma me, and it's like a separate, but it's connected, and it affects the other side. So it's almost like you've got two personalities having a fight over the same body, but it is separate. And the trauma is almost like a scar. That's how it feels, and it's like a different personality. The trauma is your fear, your anger, your vulnerability. It doesn't need sleep. I need sleep, but trauma doesn't need sleep. It does what it wants to do, and it will literally go 24/7, given half the chance. And it's something that you have to manage, because it's like having a gammy leg. My leg is not. Say your leg isn't working properly and it limps. That's what trauma is in my brain. That's how it's affected me. To me, that feels organic. Yes, it's also mental effect, but it feels a physical effect. It's almost like part of my brain is just disconnected and made another part.
So it's almost Jekyll and Hyde.
Yes.
Almost schizophrenia.
Yes. However, I don't hear voices, lots of other voices. This is a part of me. It's an internal voice that's mine, but it's a separate part of me, and it's not. It's also not something I want. I would like to leave home, thank you very much, and leave trauma behind. But no, trauma is a part of me, and that's why it's so difficult to deal with. And I think that's why it's been so difficult for me to deal with all my life, because I didn't have any tools to deal with something that is separate but part of me. It's like having an extra limb.
So you mentioned early on there, and I know if Angela listens to this, the lady who lives nearby me and actually stopped me and mentioned about the first one we did that she'd listened to.
Yeah.
And her trauma started early on when she'd lost her mum, which I hope she doesn't mind me saying, if she's listening, well, when she does listen anyway, when it goes on. Do you think, I can't know the answer to this question, but I'll ask you anyway because I want to hear what you think. Because it happened early on and continued to happen, and because you were going through the developmental stage and you didn't have the tools to cope, Do you think it disturbed your thought processes, and did it affect the things that you did? Did you think that change, and it does, that change in the way your brain thinks and what it stops you doing or what it enables you to do you think that in some way inhibited your development in some way?
Yes, I've always felt like I didn't develop properly in a way that other people who were more stable was, and that possibly makes me sound a bit crazy, but it's perfectly natural for me when I think about it, why it happened. It's logical. Me, the part of myself needed protecting, so I feel that my brain went, right, okay, this is not good, this is going to damage. How do I protect the core? I disconnect it, I make it separate, and it's almost like a protection. I feel that's why it's happened. So the only downside to that is that how you would normally develop is interfered with, because you've got this other part that is dominant. It's almost like a dominant personality. The trauma me is dominant, and in lots of times in my life it's been very dominant, and I've battled with it. My core me has the strength in some way to do that, but sometimes trauma me is stronger, and it's almost like I have these two parts of me having a dialogue. The part of me that I want to be, the person I want to be, is saying, now you stop it because this is not good. But trauma saying, no, you can go away because I'm having a field day here. And sometimes trauma is much stronger and it buries everything else. So as a child, I remember really struggling because trauma was very much in charge. And that's why I was disconnected from the world, learning, people, communication, everything that you would expect to happen and grow and develop normally as you come into adulthood.
So then that would or should affect future relationships and how you deal with relationships, how you interact with other people, how you become close to people or not become close to people. Do you think that it in some ways, because you would have obviously looked at other people, you'd have contrasted how you were moving through and your relationships.
Yeah, I did that.
So when you contrasted that with your own relationships, whether it was with a boyfriend or whatever, did it affect how you were with people in the future?
Yes, because there's different levels of why that trauma happened. There's you got the extreme side of it, violence and being hurt, physically hurt. But you've got that other bit where it's putting you down and undermining and you're spending most of your time trying not to do things wrong. Trauma, my trauma is underpinned by fear. So I spent most of my life living with that. My youth was extremely fearful. That's it. I was scared all the time. So when I got coming into adulthood, I spent my time trying not to do things wrong, because there was consequences to that, and so a more settled, stable personality would accept that things went wrong. But trauma doesn't like that. Trauma me does not like that. Trauma says, no, we can't do that. You must do this so that that person won't be upset, or this won't happen, or that might happen. So you don't interact in the same way. You spend most of your time trying to make it right so somebody else won't be upset. Your relationships are all one-sided, they're all out of balance.
Do you think then, I mean, that obviously happens quite a lot when people have a traumatic event very early on, especially when they're very young. It almost consumes that development and fractures particular ways of dealing with people, such as trust,
Yeah.
understanding where someone's coming from, the desire to fit in, the ability to actually become very resigned when actually you don't really want to become resigned, but you'll do things to keep people happy.
Yeah.
Did you find that with that you had enough control to override that? Or, I mean, you mentioned about trauma, and I like the way you have that dichotomy going on. Do you think that it took away the control to have what I would say a positive relationship with people? And did you always try to fit in with the other person just to keep them happy at the expense of yourself? Is that something that you remember doing?
I've done that all the time. I've done it with family, with partner. I've done it all the time. I've done it at work. I've endured bullying when anybody else would have stood up and said no. To a point I would do it, and then I'll get a bit snarly because I take too much. But yeah, I have ducked my head so many times. I have put myself out for people to make it so they wouldn't be angry with me, they wouldn't be upset with me, and they would like me, because that's okay, that's how it should be. I must do it right, because of instances that happened when I was younger. If I didn't do something right, there would be an outburst of either violence or anger, and so you'll do anything to avoid that, and that's trauma me. That's what trauma me does. It goes through life scared and frightened and avoiding any instances that might be emotionally or physically scary. So, I've worked myself into the ground trying to help everybody else just so it would be okay. Because that's what trauma said. That's what I have to do. You've got to do that, because they'll be upset. And if you don't get that right, then you... And it's almost like a kick. It was a constant feeling of being unsettled. And if I didn't get that right, I'd be in trouble. So I've got to get that right. And I would worry to death to make sure I got it right. Trauma is a nightmare. It does it in your sleep. I've woke up and it's almost like trauma me. It's been going at it all night, jabbering away about stuff. I'm thinking, for goodness sake, have you not slept at all? You're exhausted because part of you is still going. It's still working away at whatever it is it's working on.
So do you think then, I'm not going to be gender specific, but we are talking about yourself as a female. Do you think that because of that and because of the trauma early on and then other things happening that put layers over that existing trauma which kind of mask it somewhat, do you think that it leaves you vulnerable in relationships? Does it leave you open to things like abuse? You mentioned bullying before there. Do you think that people would get a sense of that because you're trying to make them happy at the expense of yourself? Because anybody listening now, I hope this helps you. Do you think that really it's a good idea to go in deep with someone when you're still dealing with that trauma? Or would it be better to actually remain slightly more distanced until you could work out exactly how this thing works? Because obviously there's particular etiquette in relationships, but if you're dealing with what you've been dealing with, and I do understand that, then really you're at massive risk in relationships.
Well, you can't... I believed for a long time, I thought I had victim tattooed on my forehead. Personal relationship, family relationship, work relationships, there was always somebody focused. It's almost like, see her, she's weak, we're going for her. Because you are vulnerable, and it shows. You don't realise it's shown, but it shows, and people will take advantage of that, and they have done many times in my life. And I haven't realised, because part of me wants to trust. Part of me wants to see the best in people, and I've tried, and then you realise, wait a minute here, this is not what I was expecting, or what's going on. And if it's been a close relationship, I sometimes have not seen that for quite a while, and then I'm trapped in that cycle, and that's really hard because you can't always find the strength to be stronger to stand up to that, because trauma you can't. Trauma you will gives you fear. Fear's there, and you can't get past that fear, and somebody is feeding that fear and using that fear against you, and you spend a lot of years stuck in that situation, and you can't see a way out. You just spend all your time trying to avoid bad things happening in that relationship so that you won't get either emotionally or physically hurt.
Do you think that people with that kind of trauma, and again I'm not being specific about yours on its own, because there's many other kinds, do you think that people in those situations are probably more at risk of becoming used sexually, emotionally, and also be predisposed to become addicted to particular things that they believe make them happy for that time, to get them away from how they're feeling? So is there a risk for people to perhaps be used sexually or become addicted to particular substances, whether it be alcohol or whatever, because it's been said that quite often people with trauma will try to block that out by using a particular thing, whether it be a substance, sexually or whatever. Do you think that's a risk for people with trauma?
I think it is a very much a risk, and it's something I've had to battle with most of my life. I'm going to have to mention, because eventually it'll come in. My mum was the one that had real problems, and she had addiction problems, and hers is historical because it goes back to generations prior, because she was dealing with that in her own life, and she wasn't able to combat her trauma, and I saw that, and part of me learned from that. I saw and I learned the risks of where I could end up. So even though I was vulnerable in a lot of ways and did get into, allow people to take advantage of me emotionally, and in some ways physically, as in physical hurt, when it came to substance abuse, I was able to be strong enough to not go down that route. But I can really understand how people can go down that route, because trauma is very strong, it's very powerful, it's overwhelming, it takes over your whole life, and it's in your head. It's literally living in your head, and you're trying to deal with that. And if people around you focus in on that, they will use those little things that they pick up against you, and you'll give in to certain things just to cope better. Or you end up in a situation like my mum did, in a violent relationship, not with my dad, with somebody else, and she was looking for a way to cope, and I totally get that. And there'll be many people like that. I consider myself very lucky not to have done that, because I could have.
So then, if you answer the question, where did you find your solace in relation to coping with trauma?
Studying and work. Music, I'll still like to listen to music. Nature, walking, getting outdoors. But studying and work, I really threw myself into that. I mean, I started studying when I was about 19-year-old, and I didn't stop until I was in my early 40s. Studied all kinds of subjects that I needed for work, and it was a focus, and it helped me quieten that trauma me. Trauma me was kind of like having a bit of fun with that, mind you, but it helped, and it allowed me to use a different kind of obsession that wasn't as detrimental to me physically and emotionally, I believe. It hasn't. It allowed me to not become addicted to food or alcohol or drugs. I became addicted to learning, and it was enjoyable. I got some pleasure out of that. I got quite a lot of pleasure out of that. But it did become a little bit like, I've done this course and I've managed to get through because I wasn't very good at school, so it was a real achievement for me. Pass this course. Now what comes next? What else can I learn?
So do you think as then the people who've had traumatic events and still have those scars, that it leaves them with a form of anxiety and the need to do things, the need to either achieve or be addicted or whatever? Do you think it leaves... Is anxiety a part of trauma?
It's a big part of trauma. I mean, my trauma affects me as in I seem to be hyper alert and in fight or flight. I mean, last week I was like a frightened chicken. I had a meltdown on one day and I couldn't cope. It interferes with my thought processes, and it's almost like you're in overdrive. That's how my trauma affects me. I'm sure it affects other people in different ways, but that's how it does it for me. So to slow that down for me, I have had to find focused activities which I enjoy, and I will turn to them to ease that. My arts and crafts, my reading, I do digital work as well. Something that taxes me and will allow me to use my brain in a focused way to override that overriding powerful anxiety and that's overwhelming. And that's how I have managed to cope. Sometimes it's just a very engrossing book. And I've seen me pick a book up and I'll start reading at 10 o'clock in the morning and I won't move till 1 o'clock in the next morning when I finished it. Because in those hours, it's got me out of that state of overwhelming fight or flight and anxiety.
So you mentioned fight or flight a number of times and it is part of it, and obviously anxiety, which I mentioned, is a major part of people who've experienced trauma.
Yeah.
And it lives with that person throughout. Now, when you trigger the fight or flight, it creates this instant, right, I need to get away or I need to deal with it.
Yeah.
So if I said to you that when something happens suddenly that's horrible, and the other things continue as well, and you weren't able to get away from it, do you think your fight or flight is continually confused and you haven't actually gone either way?
Yes, you're stuck in it. And because sometimes you can't actually deal with what's coming at you or what's affected you, you're stuck in a really bad place. It's kind of, it's almost like I'm trying to get out of my own skin. And your whole body's being affected. Your stomach's going, you get headaches. It's almost like I'm trying to move, I want to move, but it's not making any difference. It is not good. And also I tend to find I get very hungry sometimes, because sometimes my body's burning, very, very quickly, physically burning. So yeah, I would say that is, if you can't, it's not like it's a danger you can deal with and it's done. It's a danger that you can't deal with and you're stuck.
So if I move you on then, because there was the other area I wanted to bring in, that's why I asked you that question.
Yeah.
You'd mentioned you saw a piece that was written up somewhere about how trauma's going to be looked at by particular people. I think it was America, was it?
Yes, yeah. It was.
And how it's dealt with. Now, I mentioned about anxiety. Most anxiety is probably treated with things like citralopam and Valium or whatever, just to kind of calm that person down. But is that enough to treat that feeling of entrapment where you are still anxious but you don't know which end to go? Now you mentioned it about the different way of looking at it or different way of treating it. Was that an aspect of it? What did they say?
They mentioned medication, but this was something to do with your work with with this anxiety and state of mind, and state of being, and I could connect to that because it is a state of being, and to be able to have the tools to deal with that would be great. I mean, I'm kind of really looking forward to the idea of tackling this through counselling, because I would really like the tools to do that. I think I mentioned in the first podcast about this partition. Now, what goes behind that wall, everybody will describe it in their own way. Mine is like an ocean, and when it overwhelmed me, it's like a tsunami. Right, so this little me on the beach, and tsunami's coming. Right, trauma me, I'm going to drown. I can't even swim. Doomed. But there's a part of me that says, right, okay, I'm going to have to learn to surf. And through the counselling, I'm hoping I learn to surf, because it's the only way to work around that. It's there, you can't get away from it, you've got to deal with it. Now I want to find the tools to do that. Because trauma me's been standing there way too long drowning, or blocking it, because he can't cope with it. But that's not the way to do it. It stays there, it's not going away.
So, if I'd said to you that normally what happens in counselling is you look at the events that took place and you talk about them and you discuss them, yeah? Now, we've talked about feelings, we've talked about ways of trying to identify what those feelings are and how you can reduce them. You know, as you mentioned about the tools, the tools to work with that. Do you think there's any need to consider continually the events that took place that caused the trauma, or should you be looking for tools to actually help you to deal with the feelings, the thoughts? Is that the better option, or would you think there's something else you can do that would actually be more effective? What would you do? Anybody listening now, this is pretty much empowering people to look at ways themselves to deal with it and not perpetually live in the past. The past was bad. It was a horrible thing. It's left traces, but it's those traces you've got to be working on and not the actual events that caused it. So what would you do? What would you tell people?
I think to say that the events aren't important, they are to an extent. It's happened. The only way they're important is as in recognising how they affected you emotionally and why they still affect you. To keep on dwelling on them, not really, because I don't see how that's going to be helpful. What it's left you with, like it's left me with, like a dual, personality, as in I've got trauma me. That has been created through the events. So, in some ways, recognise the events, but not focus on the events, because that's not going to help really. You've been left with other things, you're living with the other things, and that's what you have to deal with. It's kind of like the other things is what's affecting every day in your life. They aren't still happening, the events that created those, but you are still living with the after effects. They're what's become part of your life. So that's what you have to deal with. That's the things that overwhelm you. That's the causes all the emotions. That affects you physically and mentally. That's what you're tackling. That's your challenge. That's the tools. I want those tools to deal with that, because that's an everyday thing. I'm not still being beaten every day. That's not happening every day, but I'm still dealing with the trauma. So
the entrapment then, where you're caught between the two poles, whether it be flight or fight, do you think that the brain and the mind still live in that particular past moment and still keep getting the same feelings and really don't know what to do?
I believe the flashbacks are that. I think I believe that memory doesn't work properly when you have traumatic experiences over long periods of time, and I think they just don't get stored right. That's why you have gaps. I believe that's why I have gaps in my memory, but it's still there. And so when you have flashbacks, sometimes waking ones or dreams, it comes back in a way that's confusing, because you think, well, did that happen? Did it really happen? Well, I think it felt like it happened, and it's confusion, and is not helpful. But unfortunately, I feel that's what the brain's doing. It's still there. You can't avoid that. How you deal with that, I wouldn't know. I would like to think I'll find a way to deal with that. The mind is trauma me. The mind loves that stuff. I want to keep all of that because that's what makes me real. That's what trauma me lives on. That's what it is. It's all about that. That's what it's about. That is all the parts of me, and I want to keep all of that, because if I don't have it, then I don't exist. And so it soaks all that up, it dredges it up, it loves it, it brings it all back, it keeps it right there, and it doesn't want you to forget it. Don't forget me, because if you forget that, you don't need me anymore, and I won't exist. And it wants to exist. It wants to be alive, and it's your worst enemy. It's definitely my worst enemy.
So if we look at you're going to be going forward for cognitive behavioural therapy,
yeah,
which for people who are listening don't know what that is, do you want to tell them what cognitive behavioural therapy is?
I'm not fully sure I understand it.
Okay, so the cognitive is in relation to thinking, the brain,
yes,
how
yeah.
it processes information.
And it's to do with behaviours, and it's a therapy to work on how you deal with those behaviours by how you think.
Right, so there's a school of thought that says that if you change the way you think about a particular past event, that if you do that a number of times, that will eventually dissipate the actual thoughts of that time and the scars that are scratched. Now, that's good, and I've used it myself before, not personally on me, but working with people. What about the emotions?
It doesn't make sense to me how that would work, and that's because it happened. How can you change how it happened? You can't change how it happened. You might be able to change it slightly how you feel about it, but it's still an event that's stuck in time, and it's past. What I feel I want to be working with is how I deal with future events and what's going on around me now, because this is a real living thing. This is a real part of me. It might be a separate part of me, but it's real. And the part of me that wants to be happy, settled, comfortable in my own skin, confident, feel safe, and all that kind of thing, and be able to cope, I want that part of me to be stronger. That's what I want. That's who I want to be. But there's another part of me that doesn't want that. And there's another part of me that says, no, I'm not having that. This is how you want to be. This is what's important. So it's detangling that. It's taking that apart and reducing that. Well, I'm not saying that's going to be easy. It's not going to be easy. And I'm not saying that's going to be something you can do permanently. But I want to shift that balance. I want to take away the power of trauma me and give it to better me.
So is the power in the cognitive, as in the thinking process, or is it in the emotions that are evoked by those past thoughts?
It's the emotions, and it's because if it was I can think myself out of something, but I can't feel myself out of it. It's emotions, it just takes over. That's what's controlling. Your mind is logical. My mind's very logical, and if it was able to control that, I would have done it years ago. But emotions, I can't control those. And emotions to me is almost like water. It's just moving around, and water goes its own way. How do you stop water? Could you grab it in your hands? Well, you can't. It just moves the way it wants to move. And that's what emotions are like. You can't grab it over. It's not physical. It's a non-physical thing that you can't tackle. It's constantly shifting. It's almost like you're running after it. Your logical brain can't deal with that. How can you deal with something that's not tangible?
So when you get the emotions, and we mentioned cognitive behavioural therapy before there, where you get a particular thought and it changes the way you think, and that should make everything okay. If you applied that to the emotions, what would be different?
I'm not sure, I haven't tried it yet. I'm kind of open that when the emotions do kick in, and they're kicking fast, it's not like a gradual thing. It's suddenly trauma's going, great, now we're having this. What? You know, it side glances you. So I would like to think it'll give me the ability to step away from what's going on, because at the moment I'm battling it in my head. There's two me's going at it, and one side is winning, and I have to think, right, okay, I'm not winning this flipping battle at the minute. I'm going to have to do something, physically do something to shut trauma up, and that's how I've dealt with it. It gets me out of a bad place, but it's not dealing with it. It's not a good way, a permanent way of doing it. Because if you haven't got anything physical I can get to, it goes. You know, it's like night times. I can't suddenly grab me pencils and start colouring or drawing or something, or because I'm lying in bed in the dark thinking, oh, for goodness sake. So I need something that I can use, that it gives me the ability to step away from that's going on, that emotional unease that's taken over. Because my logical brain at the minute isn't able to do it.
So going back to what we started with, which is what you believe trauma is, I think we've probably covered quite a lot there, and I think probably to the listeners and probably to yourself, you'll realise how difficult it is to live with and work with as a therapist trauma itself. So I'm going to ask the question which I asked you earlier on when we started, only this time there's going to be an added aspect to the question. If I ask the question what trauma is, and then add on, do you think it is emotional and cognitive together at the same time, what would you then say trauma is?
Trauma to me is not a mental illness, it's a physical illness. It's a physical damage, and it affects you cognitive and emotionally, because you don't develop the same, or it damages you emotionally to be able to cope with life. And the mind can be a wonderful thing. It can allow you to pick up your own body weight in a deadlift if you get your mind right. That helps you do that. It can do extraordinary things, but it also can be your worst enemy. It can destroy you. And so trauma affects both. And if you have that scar, physical scar, you combat both. So both has to be dealt with. How you do that, I don't know. I mean, maybe there's some really clever people out there who are going to work on that. Maybe they'll find a way to heal. Maybe they'll see lesions or whatever and they'll find a way to heal that. Maybe there is a medication that can develop that does that, to heal a scar, to enable the brain to work better with the emotional side, with the mental side. Maybe there'll be a two-pronged approach. I don't know. I do feel that would be important though, personally.
So are we saying then that trauma is something that damages people emotionally and cognitively?
Yes, I would say so. because some trauma affects people to the extent that they can't even learn properly and have real difficulties speaking and moving at all physically. So yes, it is. It's almost like brain damage.
So you really can't. This is my thoughts anyway. You can't separate the emotional scars from the cognitive scars. So when you work with CBT and you only work with changing the way you think, but you don't work on the emotional aspect, then you're only dealing with one part of it. So the cognitive and the emotional in trauma, I believe, are inextricably linked, and one can create the other.
Yeah.
So you could say, well, let's make people stronger emotionally, but that's a little bit cheeky, because actually a lot of people who've got through with trauma are very strong emotionally. So you're right what you said before there, maybe in the future someone like Dr. Spock or his relation, whatever, will be able to find something like that. But it's so complex that at the moment there is no real fundamental answer to how you actually treat it. But I think if you make it personal to you, and you work with your thoughts and your emotions, I think you've probably got a little bit better chance of kind of moving forward a wee bit. But you can't separate the two. There is no quick fix, and I think that's what a lot of people go to therapists and expect to get. I think if you accept that traumatic event or the subsequent events that occurred are actually have caused this, you can maybe say to yourself, okay, yeah, that happened, and I do get times when I'm reminded of that. I think if you can accept that's going to happen as you're working with it, because you mentioned a number of times about trying to get away from it, trying to do this, trying to do that, or whatever. I think if I had to give anybody advice that's listening to this now, whatever you do, don't try to run away from that trauma, because they're echoes of your past. They're trying to tell you something. It needs to be dealt with. It was stuck in the middle somewhere, and in your case, it still is to a certain extent. Although you have moved on quite a lot. I think if you're going to take anything from this, and you've heard quite a lot from Trey, just accept it's happened. That's the major one for me. Accept that this particular thing's occurred. But don't just think that one particular therapist is going to cure it or massively help it. It's going to take a number of different inputs. But the major one is yourself.
Yes, and I think it helped me when I started to realise that it was almost like there was two parts of me, because it is fractured, and I do feel fractured. And that makes me think of the brain damage, because it is almost like there's another personality, and I don't feel strange about that. That just seems that's what's happened. I've accepted that. It helps in some ways, because if you know you're dealing with another part of you that is is working in a way that's not good for you, is detrimental for you physically, and mentally and emotionally. In some ways you can deal with that a little bit.
Yeah, I think well, yeah, I agree with that. I think I said to you some time ago when we first started talking about it, about you have to, once you've accepted that's how it is, and it's a massive one. I see that as a massive tool to put in your box right away for most people anyway. I think once you've accepted, you've got to see it as a form of training. We talk about mindfulness. That's something that people regularly do now. They go and train, and I'm kind of with that to a certain extent. But there's only so long you can actually put a raisin in your hand and roll it around. I think you have to train yourself emotionally, physically, and mentally each day.
Yes. Because
it's a bit like dressing a wound that probably won't fully heal. You're going to be looking after it each day. And you mentioned about fractured, we talked about damage before there. I see trauma as a wound.
Yes.
It's a wound to you totally as a person and how you move through life. And you have to continually treat that wound with care.
You're managing a condition.
Absolutely. And I think going back to the earlier thing I mentioned, which I'd written down in my little book, with a picture of the rabbit on the front from Alice in Wonderland, I think it was, or Alice in the Looking Glass.
Yeah.
I'd written down on my little book, you'd mentioned early on about this initiative now about the treatment of trauma from that piece that you'd read. What was it about that article? Because we talked about training now and about treating a wound, etc. What was it about the article that kind of turned your head in relation to your own trauma?
That it wasn't considered a mental health, it was a physical injury, and that I could connect to that because I could say, yes, that's how it feels for me. And also, I think I would like to say that if anybody else has said, oh yes, I feel a bit like that, oh, I'm dealing with it, it feels a bit like that to me, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with you. It's perfectly natural. And you shouldn't feel badly about that. You're not barking crazy. You know, this is a damaged part of you. It's damage, and you should see it that way. And you shouldn't feel guilty or shame for that. Accept that that's what it is. You wouldn't feel shame if you lost your leg and you had to have a false leg or walk with sticks. You wouldn't feel shame about that. Why should you? You know, it's a physical damage, and this is physical damage to the brain. And for me, it's kind of like a fracture as it's created another personality, and that's how it feels to me. Other people will be different. Maybe other people say, oh yes, that's how it feels to me. And that's fine. That's natural, and there's nothing wrong with that. You're not going to get, I don't believe you'll be sectioned for that. You know, I'm not running around a threat and crazy, and a threat to anybody else or even to myself. I think actually that is a good way to see it, because in some ways it's kept me safe. It's kept me from hurting myself. I haven't resorted to physically harming myself. I haven't resorted to taking drugs and harming myself in that way, or alcohol, or smoking even, because I've seen it as another personality, as in the damaged me. And I am battling with that. And it's maybe not a battle that I've always won, but I've seen it that way. And if you're battling something like that, like you would cancer, then you're fighting against damage, and that's how it should be. You're managing that injury, and it helped me do that. That has helped me keep me right in some ways, though it doesn't sound like it has, but it has.
Yeah, so I think acceptance is one of the major tools we'll put in the toolbox for people.
Yeah.
Accepting that they've been damaged in some way, shape or form. It's not shameful, they're not being embarrassed by it. No. They're not stir crazy, because that is pretty much how people with mental health problems, although we're not saying that's what trauma is, it could be classed as that. I'm not quite sure the umbrella it's under now, because there's a lot of change going on. People are stigmatised with mental health conditions, and if you've got trauma, you're going to be stigmatised the same way.
Yeah.
And that's going to make it hard for you to accept that you've been injured, you've been damaged, you've been fractured, and this is about helping to heal that wound, or try to work with it, dress it, look after it, whatever, as you go through life. And something that you can train yourself to do. And I think that if more people did that, we could actually help each other to get through with trauma. You know, you get a group of people to get together rather than being trapped in isolation, which is what tends to happen. You know, you get people together who can talk to each other about their own personal experiences. But I think the major tool that goes in the box before the next episode of Trey and Harry's podcast is acceptance.
Yes, accept that it's happened, accept it's a part of you, it's an injury, and you're managing it. And however it affects you, accept that. And it hopefully will give you the strength not to be overwhelmed by it.
Thanks, folks. That's the end of part 2 of Harry and Trey's discussion on trauma. I hope it's been of some help. Once it gets posted on our blog,
Yes,
Facebook
and Facebook page.
Please check it out, and again, if you've got any comments at all, the same as Angela did about the previous one, then please get in touch, and we'll have a bit of a chat or whatever about it. And if we can help in some way, then we most certainly will. Okay, that's a wrap. Thank you.